Hello everyone, welcome to week 4. The topic of today's lecture is morpheme, morph and allomorph. So, we have started talking about morphology since the last class. In today's class, we will be talking about identification of morphemes, how to define morph. So, this is a new term which is coming in apart from morpheme. We will also talk about defining allomorph, another new term. Then we will talk about the concept of conditioning and how this is important in the domain of morphology, and we will talk about the use of data for conducting morphological analysis. In the last class, we were talking about the difference between word forms and lexemes, if you remember. So, basically we did say that word forms are realizations of lexemes, and lexeme is an abstract idea, if you remember from the last class. We also discussed some examples. So, if you consider the example that I have given here, see, saw, seeing, seen, sees, these all are physical word forms of the lexeme see. So, see is the abstract lexeme, and the representation, the realization of the word forms are basically see, saw, seeing, seen, these are all physical word forms. So, how do we consider a word? A word can be considered as a representation of a lexeme that is associated with some morphosyntactic properties. So, I have highlighted this part, morphosyntactic properties, to remind you that we have to talk about the link between morphology and syntax while doing morphology. So, we have not done syntax yet, but you know by now that it is related to the structure of phrases and sentences. Even when we will be doing analysis of morphology, we will be talking about syntax partially, because morphology talks about the relationship between morphology and syntax. So, we can refer to a word as a grammatical word in this sense when we are talking about morphosyntactic properties. For example, you can say that one particular word has a grammatical category. In the last class, we were talking about grammatical categories like noun, verb, etc. So, you can refer to a word as grammatical word in this sense. This is the same example that we discussed in the last class, but I have more detailed clarification in this example now. So, you can say cut can represent two grammatical words. The word cut, it can represent two grammatical words. Why? Because as you know from the previous class, we can actually talk about two different grammatical categories while giving example from this word. So, cut can be verb present non third person singular, I mean it not cuts, or it can be verb past. Again cut can be noun singular. So, the first two are basically from the verbal lexeme, and the third one belongs to a nominal lexeme. We already discussed these examples in the last class. So, we can say that cut the noun is a different lexeme from cut the verb. It belongs to two different word classes. Here we are talking about the idea of grammatical categories. So, importance of grammatical word, you can see here that the 2 points that I have mentioned, it can help us to understand the relation between words and sentences. As I was telling you, in morphology we have to understand different compositions of word, different ways of creating or forming words, but we will also try to understand the relationship between words and sentences. We will also do the same kind of analysis in the future classes, and it will also help us to understand the boundary between morphology and syntax. If you go back to the class where we discussed levels, different levels in linguistics, we did talk about different domains of analysis. So, we also get a lot of help from deciding the boundary between morphology and syntax. You can say that words are morphologically complex. So, I have given one example and let us see why it is often said that words are morphologically complex. We know we can break a word into smaller units. We were actually doing that in the last class. I asked you to break some words and also create your own set of examples for breaking them into smaller parts. So, we can break words into smaller units that are meaningful. If you remember the definition of morpheme, we will be again discussing that in today's class. So, small meaningful units, but there can be additional complexities. What kind of complexities? If you consider this word boots, so boot refer to one item and you can say that sir is the plural marker in English, but if you say boot minus the plural marker sir, there is still some indication of a plurality, because you are not talking to one single item, though you are saying boot, there is some kind of plurality in terms of the meaning. So, that is why we often say that this is a complex term, we need to understand the semantic components as well. So, we have another definition of morpheme here, which is slightly simpler. Morphemes are smallest indivisible unit of semantic content or grammatical function from which the words are made up. So, this is pretty simple, and when I will be suggesting the reading for morphology, you will also read about the definition from the text that I will suggest, and many of you are already familiar with the text. So, here we are talking about smallest unit. You cannot actually divide them if you think about semantic content and grammatical function. So, we have to keep both the conditions in mind, semantic content and grammatical function. Without considering these two criteria, we cannot define a morpheme. This is the golden rule. So, when we talk about a morpheme, do we talk about a single sound or a group of sounds? So, by now you know you are familiar with the concept of phoneme, and so when I am saying that a single sound or a group of sounds, you can think about multiple examples for yourself. But when I am saying that whether morpheme is a single sound or a group of sounds, I think all of us are thinking the same kind of answer. It depends. It depends on the position of occurrence. So, if you consider the following examples, there are 4 words actually: untidy, unjust, uncle and under. So, I am sure that all of you understood that the status of un is not same for all the examples. So, the question that I have asked is, can you say that the status of un is same for all the examples? The answer is no, because for untidy and unjust, you can get some kind of semantic commonness, but for uncle and under you cannot break them as a separate morpheme actually, because you know with CLE and DER, I mean you cannot get any other meaning. These are not morphemes, though these are phonologically similar. So, when we break the morphemes, we have to keep the meaning in mind. So, even in the previous class when we were breaking the words, first of all we were not randomly breaking them, we already talked about it. We were keeping some kind of rule in our mind, which is related to the tacit knowledge again. So, here we have to keep the meaning component in mind, which is very important. We have to think about the grammatical and semantic value as understood from the definition as well. So, morphemes are often compared with the pieces of Lego. So, when you build something with Lego, the building blocks, you can create different kind of items, right. Similarly, we can create different words by using these morphemes, the building blocks. And recurrent parts of the word that have the same meaning are recognized as manifestations of the same morpheme. So, we do club different types of morphemes together. In the next class, we will be talking in more detail about this fact, but today let us talk about it in a different way. So, recurrence in a large number of words is not an essential property of morphemes. You can get examples of morphemes in any language when you even if you you can find examples in only a few words, maybe one word. So, when we try to identify morpheme from a set of data, any data that you have for the purpose of analysis, you may have different purpose for analyzing them, but we do need to conduct morphological analysis for various purposes. So, we need to remember a few things while conducting the analysis. So, a set of discovery procedures can be helpful in conducting a fruitful morphological analysis, and we have to make generalizations based on the data collected from any language. So, generalization when you start collecting data, it happens at times that while collecting the data you figure out the generalization. Maybe you are not a speaker of the language on which you are collecting the data, but you quickly figure out the generalization. In some languages it is not so easy, you have to sit down with more examples and then carefully figure out the generalization. And while doing the generalization, we have to keep both semantic criteria and the grammatical structure criteria in mind. If you remember, in the last class we talked about the principle of contrast, which is very much needed for the analysis. So, what do we mean by principle of contrast? We need to understand both the phonological shape and meaning of the morphemes. So, we have to consider both in order to figure out whether these are important components of the target morphological analysis. So, this is the definition that we read together in the last class. I am reading it again. So, this is a little more complex definition. If you feel free to use the previous one, you can do that. The morpheme is the smallest difference in the shape of a word that correlate with the smallest difference in word or sentence meaning or in grammatical structure. So, the highlighted words will be useful for you. So, now we have a definition of morpheme. We understand that we have to keep certain criteria in mind in order to do morphological analysis. Now, let me introduce you to another term, which is again an important term in morphology, which is morph. So, morpheme is an abstract idea, morph is something which is concrete. So, you can say that the analysis of morphemes begin with isolation of morphs. So, morphs do exist in languages and you have to isolate them while conducting the morphological analysis and isolate them based on certain criteria. So, what is a morph? How will you define them? You can say that a morph is a physical form representing a morpheme in a language, and it is a recurrent distinctive sound or sequences of sounds. So, it can be one sound or a combination of several sequence of sounds, but this is something which is a physical form that we have to remember. So, I have a very common example which many of you know, or you know similar examples from English. So, if I ask you to pronounce the plural marker of the following words, cats, dogs and roses, you can figure out. I have deliberately used IPA here, so that you can understand that there are different phonological representations, s, z and is. So, what is happening here? These are all plural markers. We know that all these are examples, are manifestations of plurality in English, but why these have different phonological shapes? So, plurals are differently manifested. All of them represent the same morpheme, but why? Why there are differences? Now, let us learn about a new concept called allomorph. You are already familiar with the idea of allophone in phonology. So, you understood that there is some kind of distribution centric division that we need for talking about this allo, the idea of allo. So, in morphology, when we talk about allomorph, we define it in this way: when different morphs represent the same morpheme, they are referred to as allomorphs. So, if you consider the examples of cats, dogs and roses, sa, za and is are basically representing the same plural morpheme in English, but these are different. So, different morphs are there, realizations are different. And as we know about location or the occurrence of allophones in phonology in complementary distribution, you can also say that allomorphs too occur in complementary distribution. So, you are already familiar with the notion of distribution. What is it? A total set of contexts in which a particular linguistic form occurs. So, we talk about the total set of contexts and then we consider the nature of distribution. So, we understood that allomorphs are morphs which which occur in complementary distribution. Now, let me tell you that there is this idea of conditioning, which is basically very helpful in order to understand the distribution of allomorphs. The allomorphs are not found in identical contexts that we have understood from the data, and there is some kind of conditioning why a particular morph is occurring in a particular position. So, there must be some restriction. Allomorphs are phonologically conditioned, grammatically conditioned and lexically conditioned. So, we have to figure out which one is useful for the data that we are having for our purpose. So, I have listed some common English words which you can see now, and I will ask you to look at the prefix and tell us what is happening. So, let me read the words for you: impossible, impatient, impolite, intangible, incomplete, ingratitude and inactive. So, when you are reading them, you understood that the prefix is basically talking about are manifestations of a same morpheme, and then there are differences. It's clear to you, right? So, if I ask you to classify them, how will you do that? There are different phonological shapes, right? So, im, in and ing, the velar one. So, now you have to understand the logic behind it or the conditions behind it. So, if I ask you to generalize the pattern, you can say that there are different morphs according to these particular phonological conditions. You can say that different morphs are occurring before bilabials and velar consonants, you can say that, right. So, im is always occurring before the bilabial consonants, because m is a bilabial nasal, ing is occurring before velar consonant because ng is a velar nasal, and in is occurring elsewhere either before an alveolar consonant or a vowel. So, there is some role of phonology here, right. I mean, though we are conducting morphological analysis, but phonology has a major role to play. So, we can say here that the allomorphs are phonologically conditioned. So, if we think about grammatical conditioning, we can consider these examples: walk and walked, sweep and swept and take and took. So, we are talking about the past tense morpheme in English, and you can understand that the morphemes change according to the nature of the verb. So, we can consider it as an example of grammatical conditioning. So, if we go back to the example of cats, dogs and roses, we can say that allomorphs are lexically conditioned. One particular lexical item or a particular lexical item is helping us to understand which plural marker to use. So, there is some kind of lexical determinant which is telling us the particular use of a allomorph or a morph. When we have both phonological and morphological reasons present together for alterations of a morph, it falls under the domain of morphophonology, or you can say morphophonemics, another term for the domain. So, we will consider both phonological and morphological component while talking about morphophonology. We consider both the conditions. So, there are more to it. I mean, we have just started talking about morphology. In the last class, we gave you some idea of mental lexicon and then defined morpheme and then talked about the idea of lexeme, grammatical word for example. Today, we started talking about morpheme and then also came to know about two more important components in the domain of morphology, morph and allomorph. But we have to do something else while doing morphology, which is basic and important. If you are doing a basic course in linguistics, you are supposed to know these. So, there are different types of morphemes. We can classify different types of morphemes. So, we also have to talk about them, and our knowledge of morpheme, morph and allomorph will be definitely useful, but we will see how we can classify them. We will also talk about certain processes which operate for the formation of words. So, the processes will be highlighted. So, we shall be discussing these in the next class. So, now I will talk about certain assumptions which are important in order to conduct morphological analysis. Rather, I am asking you not to assume certain things. So, suppose you are analyzing data from a language which is very different from your language. You do not know, you have a basic background or you do not have a basic background of the language, you just have the data. Do not assume that the morphemes of the target language is similar with the language that you know or you speak. It can have a very different pattern. We will also talk about how we can do different patterning for different languages of the world based on certain types. So, we will be talking about them in future, but for basic analysis you should know this golden rule that no assumptions are needed for the basic analysis or to begin the analysis. And semantic contrasts can be different as well. So, maybe certain examples are examples of allomorph in one language, but it is not at all allomorph in some other language. So, do not assume that if language A considers the examples as allomorph, language B will also consider them as allomorph. So, this is very important, and also you have to remember that one morpheme can have more than one forms. So, we should not be misled from the examples of homophonous forms where maybe it is a different kind of morpheme. So, what do we have to do if you come across such examples? We need to check the meaning and the context. So, we need to check the meaning and also the context, because you know context also changes the nature of morpheme. So, we need to remember these golden rules while conducting any kind of morphological analysis, and today I have a set of data for you that you can solve by yourself. This is not at all complex, and this is taken from a language called Irarutu in Indonesia. So, I will ask you to generalize the data. I am not asking you to name the different parts, we will be talking about these names later, but now our job is to figure out the different morphemes. We have the gloss or the meaning, because you know we cannot do anything without the meaning. When we work on any language, we have the data in IPA, and you also have the meaning component. So, both the phonological form and the meaning help us to conduct any kind of analysis, right. By now, you have understood that. So, we have to go through the meaning and examine the phonological shape. So, Adena my mother, Odena your mother, Idena his mother. So, I am not reading them out, but you can simply go through the data and do this analysis for yourself. So, you will have a set of morphemes and their meaning, and we will be starting the next class from the results that you will be receiving after conducting the morphological analysis by yourself. So, we will come to the concluding part of today's class. So, what are the basic learnings that we have done today? We talked about morphological analysis and certain notions related to morphological analysis. We talked about identification of allomorphs, how different conditions help us to identify allomorphs, because you know there are conditionings, for example, phonological, grammatical and lexical conditioning, which help us to identify or to understand the restrictions for the occurrence of allomorphs. So, I hope you will actually go through the data and solve the puzzle. Here are the basic references that I have used for today's class. Thank you. See you again.